This is Bold Dominion, an explainer for state politics in a changing Virginia. I'm Nathan Moore. Well, after our last episode of Bold Dominion, somebody on Reddit said that this show was trash. Well, I'm pleased to announce that this week, that person is absolutely right. This episode is all about trash. Specifically Virginia's trash, or at least trash that ends up in Virginia. So I don't know about you, but every Sunday evening I take my non-recyclable trash out to the curb. And I'll be honest, after the trash truck picks it up on Monday mornings, I really don't think much more about where my trash ends up. I think that's probably pretty typical. Probably typical for people who live in Maryland and North Carolina and New Jersey too. But here's the crazy thing. When somebody in Hoboken or Hagerstown takes their trash to the curb, there's a decent chance that it gets dumped in a Virginia mega landfill. Virginia is a bona fide trash capital. For decades, Virginia's been the second biggest importer of trash from other states. We even accept trash from Central and South American countries. About a quarter of all the trash dumped in Virginia actually originates from outside the state. Well, one state's trash must be our state's treasure, because waste management is a surprisingly profitable enterprise. Per-ton trash disposal fees in Virginia are among the lowest on the East Coast. And Virginia charges no fees for out-of-state trash imports. You can thank the state's pro-business ideology and some well-placed corporate campaign donations for that one. So where does that trash land in Virginia? Who's it get dumped on? I want you to take a moment to picture 1,000 football fields. That's 1 mile by 1 mile. Now imagine all that land filled with garbage, like really, really filled. The garbage is stacked high, 300, 400, 500 feet tall, taller than the Washington Monument. That, what you're trying to imagine, it's probably hard to do so, but that is what a mega landfill looks like. Virginia has 15 of these mega landfills, privately run with enormous economies of scale and quite a bit of profit. And they're mostly located in low-income and rural areas. Well, now there's a proposal for another mega landfill in Cumberland County, located between Richmond and Charlottesville. And this mega landfill threatens the safety and local history of a rural community there.
We unequivocally do not want this here. We don't want this landfill, so there's like no bargaining, there's no bartering for the exchange of our lives, cutting short our lives.
That's Queen Zakiya Shabazz. She's the executive director of United Parents Against Lead, and she's the coordinator of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative. In the second half of today's episode, she'll tell us more about her organization's work fighting against waste management companies on behalf of people of color and low-income communities. But first, we turn to friend of the show and Richmond-based journalist Peter Galaska. He tells us about how Virginia became such a dumping ground, and how the state has managed to keep it a hidden issue. So Peter, this week's episode is one of those topics that comes from just kind of sitting around the newsroom and shooting the bull. You and I were talking a few days ago about stuff going on in the state, and you turned me on to something I really didn't know about, which is that Virginia imports a hell of a lot of trash from other states. Take me through the story.
Well, it's actually an old story. Virginia has been number 2 in the country in accepting out-of-state and out-of-country waste. And this has been the case since like the 1990s when Waste Management, which is a really giant, I think it's based in Texas, a giant corporation, built a number of big landfills in Virginia. The one up in Cumberland that's being proposed and opposed is owned by County Waste, which is another out-of-state big management company. I think they're based out of New York. Anyway, so it really goes to show what's been simmering here for at least 20 years.
Yeah, let's back it up and talk about some of the history of trash in Virginia. There was a time when each city, municipality kind of had its own landfill somewhere, and it would just take the trash from the city and go dump it in the landfill. Mm-hmm. That has really been outsourced a lot in recent decades, and now you've got a much, much more centralized operation in Virginia. I think I read that there's really only 7 mega landfills around the state, and most municipalities, including Charlottesville and Albemarle here where I live, there's no landfill here that gets shipped off to a mega landfill closer to you in Chesterfield. Right.
Well, here's the deal, is that in the waste industry, which is a hugely profitable industry, you have been a great deal of consolidation where you have big companies coming in and buying up little companies and landfills and putting it all together, or building a whole new landfill that they can operate in a profit-making way. In the 1990s and early 2000s, from then on, a lot of these companies, especially Waste Management, were giving money to both parties, and this is over a period of years. And what this did was, fuel the path for big, out. It's not just to benefit Virginia, obviously. I mean, we're taking the biggest exporter of trash historically have been like places like New York City, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., North Carolina. And what's interesting is that according to the Virginian pilot, 24 states overall send trash to Virginia, including foreign countries such as Canada, Mexico, and a number from Central and South America. So you've got to ask a question, why us? What do we get out of it?
Peter, that's my next question to you, really. But I want to kind of talk a little bit more about what the volume of trash is we're talking about. It's what, 5.8 million tons of trash per year?
Yeah, I think the peak was 7.7 million tons in 2004. Mm-hmm. And then in later years, it kind of hovered around 5.3 million tons a year. Yeah. And there's been a recent spike. And one of the reasons the trash is here is that Virginia charges imported trash senders among the lowest fees in the country. And it must be some mentality that we're the pro-business state,
Being like the world's dump is not exactly the Virginia for lovers, trash lovers, I don't think is quite the slogan and they're going for with that. But here we are. I mean, and that 5.8 million tons of trash per year imported to Virginia, I was shocked. That's a quarter of all the trash that ends up in Virginia. I mean, actual Virginians might generate 15 or 16 million tons of trash, but imports are another 5 or 6. That's a lot of garbage.
Right. Well, the other thing is of concern, too, if you read the stories, is that, a lot of times the laws do not require these companies to keep very detailed records of what they're accepting. Obviously, they can't accept certain hazardous chemicals and items, but, are they really sealed? Are there liners underneath to prevent it from leaching into the groundwater? And they also tend to be in poor areas, say in the peninsulas, sort of more remote areas. I know there's a big one. Waste Management has a big dump in Amelia. In the Cumberland County case, if it goes through, that would handle hundreds of trucks a day bringing garbage in, and 24 hours a day. So if you live nearby there, and Cumberland is one of the poorest counties in Virginia and only has about 10,000 people, and they're trying to fight it, but, what are you going to do?
Well, Peter, you and I have talked a lot about other kind of corporate power and big money in Virginia here, and I know the scale is different when we talk about something like Dominion, but at the same time, big company that has national ambition, making lots of profits off of environmentally awful stuff. I mean, what makes this different? Why is this not a bigger issue?
Well, it was. I mean, it sort of died recently, but it's always been around, and now it's coming back again. And one of the reasons why Virginia gets so much of it is because of its central mid-Atlantic location. It can get it from the north, like New Jersey and New York City, and from the south, like North Carolina. And they don't want to deal with their waste, so it comes here.
Sure. And our fees are certainly a lot lower on a sort of per ton basis than, New Jersey, Massachusetts, places like that. Northam proposed an extra basically $5 per ton, state fee that would also presumably increase state revenues. And that did not go through. Why? What's going on?
Well, there's this kind of mentality among the General Assembly about especially the older people that we have to have this pro-business image. Now, that's fine if you're trying to, bring in well-paying, sustainable, useful, non-polluting industries. But the mentality doesn't quite go around that. And they think that if you start having higher fees and greater regulations, it's an original sin. It's bad. And of course, what you're doing is risking Virginians' health and the environment because of this kind of crazy mentality. This whole waste importing mentality and situation has been around for years, and it's still growing.
Peter, I'm noticing an interesting confluence too around kind of how this all got started, and I noticed that Virginia started keeping track of trash imports in 1998. There was some kind of increase in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Hmm.
Waste Management, the big waste disposal
Hmm.
company that you and I just talked about, based out
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
Texas, they started donating thousands of dollars to both Republicans and Democrats in
Hmm.
1998, and that
Hmm.
continued into the aughts. Um, what factors might have led to all of a sudden a lot more trash coming into Virginia around the turn of the millennium?
I think it's sort of corporate forces and market dynamics are probably great. You know responsible for this. What you had were I remember back in the 1970s and early 1980s, there were two big players generally in the waste business. One was Waste Management, and the other was Browning Ferris. They were really pushing this novel concept of the huge trash company, not your local county landfill. And and then they were really consolidating it. There was a mad buying spree going around where these companies would go and pick up smaller ones, mom and pop operations, or local government run ones that the local governments didn't really want to have to bother with anymore. And these people would come and say, we can do this much more efficiently and safely. And they had a lot of PR about it. And they kind of grew into behemoths. And there was money to be made in running a sort of a highly centralized operation. And you could run several huge landfills more cheaply than a bunch of little scattered ones. And Virginia just bit.
I do want to ask about the proposed mega landfill in Cumberland County, but also the other seven that are in the state. I mean, how did the decisions get made about where these go?
Well, what happens basically is, of course, the companies come in, start surveying land, and they, write up proposals and send them to, the planning department and the board of supervisors and things like that. And they add some goodies, and there's some kinds of cheap goodies. Let me see where I can find that. I know that in the Cumberland case, Green Ridge has come in and wants to give, I think it's $60,000 to the county. And get this, they want to offer $4,000 for school band uniforms.
Well, I'm sure the kids would like that.
I mean, it's just like, yeah.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of studies out there about the health effects of living near a landfill. So, when we put these in places, somebody's going to suffer for it. Like you said, this was a bigger issue at one point back around 2000, 2004. Politicians from both sides of the aisle, some of them, made noise about this. Have we just sort of gotten to a place where Virginia accepts it, doesn't think it's a big deal anymore? I don't quite understand how this fell off the radar.
Well, it can get back on the radar. And here, just take the example, which is just very recently, 2 or 3, 4 years ago, about coal ash. Duke Energy down in North Carolina had a big coal ash retainment. This is the ash from coal that was burned to generate power. And some pipes broke. And so a great deal of coal ash waste went into the Dan River and flowed northward into Virginia near Danville. And that raised a big outcry. And meantime, Dominion was trying to, had a number of coal ash pits, like Bramo Bluffs on the James River and Chesapeake, and one up near on the Potomac. And they just wanted to do the cheapo way of, securing it, because they did want to dispose of it somehow, but they wanted to do it on a cheap way. And somehow the combination of the Dan River mess and people interested, like the Sierra Club and other, even like, kayaking groups. And then this sort of coalition comes together and of, sports enthusiasts, environmentalists, people, municipal leaders, politicians. And now they forced Dominion to greatly tighten how they were going to handle the coal ash. So can something like this happen as far as garbage? I don't know. Could be. Problem is, usually something really bad has to happen first, which is really sad.
I mean, what comes next with all this trash in Virginia?
Well, first off, it's going to be really hard because, obviously, as you've noted from the political payments and donations, they're pretty well entrenched. And, it's the same thing as Dominion. I mean, Clean Virginia, a progressive organization, is really trying to identify politicians in Virginia who do not take Dominion's money And I don't know, there's a number of examples where it's sort of come together. But as I say, this is a hidden issue. And somehow keeping a very low profile really helps these companies make money, because they're still pulling in the garbage from Virginia, and a quarter of their total comes from out of state. And that's because other states don't want to deal with it, and Virginia is willing to accept it for very little. So you've got to get rid of that mentality, like we're going to sell ourselves because it's capitalism. And that's great because we're a pro-business state. You want that in some ways, but not in others. And this is obviously one way you don't want that.
Peter Galaska is a journalist based in the Richmond area. Stick around. In the second half of today's show, we'll talk with Queen Zakiya Shabazz, the coordinator of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative. You're listening to Bold Dominion, a state politics explainer for Changing Virginia. Visit us online at bolddominion.org. Have a friend who's trying to get into state politics? Well, tell them about this show and then subscribe. Find us online in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever fine podcasts are served up. Hey, while you're there, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. We like those. Bold Dominion is a member of the Virginia Audio Collective, online at virginiaaudio.org. Check out all the podcasts from the collective, from science to history to music to community affairs. We amplify the voices of people in our community and help them tell stories that matter. You can listen and subscribe at virginiaaudio.org. So earlier in the episode, we talked about Virginia's quiet business in trading trash for cash. But what do these pro-business interests mean for the health and safety of Virginians living near mega landfills? Bold Dominion assistant producer Annie Parnell spoke with Queen Zakiya Shabazz, who just wrote a piece about this in the Washington Post. She's the coordinator of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative, which works to support the health of communities overburdened by pollution in Virginia.
Could you give us some context for the term environmental justice for those of our listeners who might be unfamiliar with it?
Environmental justice means fair treatment and engagement of communities and the people that have the potential to be impacted by any kind of pollutant entities or any type of environmental harm. And we were successful in getting an environmental justice, an EJ bill passed in 2020 that we're hoping that Virginia will, will subscribe to, and actually, start taking it seriously and not putting our people at further risk in what we call environmental justice communities, fence line, front line communities, and sacrifice zone communities.
Centering then in on Virginia, what are some of the ways that our waste disposal system in this state disproportionately affects low-income communities and people of color?
Well, first, it always targets low-income communities because it feels that they won't have any opposition, they won't have a voice, it won't have anyone to contest, won't have a fight. But it adds to the cumulative impacts of illnesses, that they're already faced with. So it exacerbates that when we talk about air quality and COPD and the high rate of asthma, in children and adults. And when we talk about, our water being contaminated, our groundwater, where else do we go for a source of water? So we're talking about our air, our water, and then our soil, where do we plant our food to grow? And it's just that there's no regard for what it does to the lives of the people living there, just for $1. It's like, profit over people. And so we've been trying to point out how wrong that is, and how to have the disregard, and also to give, the communities, put the power back in the hands of the communities, that we're not just going to sit quietly by, and let you harm us for generations to come, because basically, you're killing us.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, definitely very important work. So kind of to zero in even more on this proposed mega landfill in Cumberland County. As you've written, this would have some serious impacts on a historic Black community in Virginia. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, this is AMMD Pine Grove community, where there's an historic Rosenwald school for one, and the landfill would be like within feet, of that. It will desecrate that land and that memory and that history. So we want to preserve the culture and the history, and it will also desecrate burial grounds that are, in close proximity right behind the school. And so traditionally, our communities have not been able to say, "Not in my backyard," so everyone else can say, put it over there, but we have up until this point have not, our voices have not been heard, but we can ward off that. So we want to protect the Pine Grove School. There are still several members that attended the school, so that history means something to them, at least if it means nothing to anyone else. And now that the school has gotten the recognition, they are eligible to be on the state and national list of historic places. So we feel that it's worthy of protecting, and in addition to protecting the homes and the lives of those people that still live, in the Pine Grove area. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that we support that community.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. So where is VEJC currently concentrating their efforts with regard to this project?
We are now helping to, we haven't talked with the Department of Transportation because there's talks about rerouting the highway, which will go around the school, but it still doesn't alleviate all of the damage that will be done. So we're basically in a supportive mode. And we are being guided by what the community wants to do. That's one thing, we it's community led. We don't go in and dictate. We're just more there to support. So we're supporting them in that effort. We're supporting them and not bargaining with Greenridge, but in saying we unequivocally do not want this here. We don't want this landfill, so there's like no bargaining, there's no bartering for the exchange of our lives, cutting short our lives. And so we really supporting them and saying we don't want the landfill placed there.
Mm-hmm. So as we kind of touched on when we first started talking, in last year's state legislative session, the state of Virginia did pass the Virginia Environmental Justice Act, which makes it state policy to sort of prioritize environmental justice and these issues of environmental racism. So what does that policy look like in practice?
Well, it looks like DEQ, the Air Board, the Water Board, and them really hearing people when they have a listening session. Someone once said, but they have listening session, but they need to have hearing sessions. So really hearing the people and taking into account what's said, but then acting upon it and letting the people's voice weigh out on whatever profit or whatever they may be paid by the corporation, that's applying for the permit, and then taking into account cumulative impacts and how this will affect people's lives and livelihood and their property. And so we're wanting them to have an environmental justice lens throughout all the state agencies. And so we now have an interagency working group in place that's supposed to ensure that. DEQ has hired a new environmental justice director, and we are in constant contact with her, and just making sure that that is taken seriously, and that when they talk about environmental justice, that they take into account for the natural, the cultural, the social, economic, and political components of a community. We're not just talking about the air and the water and the natural, but all the cultural and historical aspects of a community as well have to be taken into consideration when we consider environmental justice. And so we just want DEQ to act like they have a clue and to really, be serious about environmental justice. As you said earlier, we not just lip service, but we need to see it in action. And I think, we were able to see that with the stopping of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. We are now also in opposition to the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And so just keeping our communities together through strength and unity, and standing, as one solid wall, against these polluting entities. I think we'll continue to see some wins, and that's very important. in the state of Virginia, where we've had lots and lots of disparities, especially in communities of color, low income communities, indigenous communities, and it's time now for us to have some racial equity, environmental justice, and Virginia has shown good faith and with us getting the act passed, but now it's time for the action.
Would you say that there's a worry then that the Environmental Justice Act is lip service?
Yeah, for me, I'm always optimistic, but there is always that worry until I actually see it, especially coming off this last session, General Assembly session, when we didn't get any gusto, maybe because of, everything was virtual and dealing with COVID, but many of our environmental justice bills did not get passed. So coming off of the success of getting the EJ Act passed, we expected more, and that just didn't happen. So, we are regrouping. We have an EJ policy team that actually, drafts the policy. And so we're looking for success, as we go into this next session, even with the special session coming up, and asking that environmental justice get the funding that it deserves, so that we can continue to offer support to these communities, but real meaningful support by going into the communities and seeing, what they're dealing with, hearing what they're dealing with. So we've created an environmental justice map, for that purpose. We have the EJ Council that has now started going into those communities. So they actually need to see that, we're dealing with people and not just numbers, not just the statistics, but these are, real lives that are being impacted. And that these people sitting on the boards have the opportunity to make the right decision. The vote is in your hand. Think of it, would you want this in your community? Would you want to be drinking water that's contaminated with lead or any of the other poisons? And that's why we are so, adamant against the landfills, because what's being permitted, who's checking that? There's still a lot of work to be done. Virginia has made a good start, but we want to hold them accountable and make sure that we continue on the path of ensuring that, everyone really has environmental justice.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the priorities leading into the special session that's coming in August?
Well, we want to build upon the EJ Act, make sure that the interagency working group are all adopting, environmental justice. We still are, again, having talks with the EJ director to bring her up to speed, because she's coming from Tennessee, to bring her up to speed on the mechanisms of environmental justice in Virginia, and just some of the issues that we've been dealing with over the past years. And again, just standing with those communities, pointing out the communities. We have the Brown Grove community that's dealing with the Wegmans distribution center. So many communities around the state that have similar issues, and just bringing all those together, putting them in front of DEQ, putting them in front of the legislatures, and saying, okay, here is, we have an EJ Act. Let's implement what we have in place. Let's use what we have.
We have the EJ Act, and as you've said, the VEJC has been trying to push the state to kind of act on that act. Are there any other further steps that you'd like to see the state take, or similar issues to the mega landfill? I know you mentioned the Wegmans distribution center.
Yes, I would like to really see the state, look upon, environmental racism. And consider, reparations, the payment of reparations, since a lot of these communities were made into EJ communities intentionally, through redlining and all of the other practices, that were, traditional to keep other people oppressed. So I would love to see the state seriously think about some compensation to the harm that's been done, to the damage that's been done, that's caused this great disparity. You hear them talking about COVID-19, but the disparities were already existing, even before the pandemic. There was a whole lot of distance and in the just talk about wealth and generational wealth. So when you talk about environmental racism and how African Americans were systematically shut down and cut off from obtaining the generational wealth. So that's why that gap is there. So I really do seriously think that needs to be addressed. The state should seriously consider in all of these the rescue care and the different funds that they're getting. So put that towards environmental justice and make sure that it gets into the communities and not handled by someone outside the community where it has to trickle down and then the community is left in the same position or worse off. Just even talking about community control funds, just putting the power back into the hands of the community, because we're suffering the disproportionate brunt of the injustices. So why shouldn't we also be able to be funded to remedy the problems? And so I would definitely say we need to be talking about some forms of reparations to people that have lived and died in environmental justice communities.
Queen Zakiya Shabbat is the coordinator of the Virginia Environmental Justice Collaborative, a statewide coalition addressing environmental justice concerns. Thanks to her, and also to journalist Peter Galaska for joining us this week. My name's Nathan Moore, and I'm the host of Bold Dominion. Huge thanks, as always, to our producers this week, Annie Parnell and Katherine Hansen, who also edited this week's show. Find us online at bolddominion.org, and don't forget to subscribe. It's just a click away.